And welcome back as we continue now our conversation started before the news with education expert Professor Mary Metcalfe, who is also a senior research associate at the University of Johannesburg. And we're speaking to the proposal that was made to Parliament yesterday by the Department of Basic Education, whereby they're basically talking about a phased-in approach to the resumption of the academic year, but of course with strict conditions in place. Professor Metcalfe, thanks so much for staying with us. Now, just getting back to what was actually proposed, and I'm just looking at those slides that were presented to the parliamentarians yesterday as well. Things like screening of learners and educators that needs to be done at the reopening of schools. And it goes on to say learners and staff members that present with raised temperature will then be considered for isolation and testing. We know the water and sanitation issue that we addressed in part at the top of this interview, Professor. There as well, there are, of course, critical issues to address. We know that there's already an indication of 3,475 schools that require assistance in this regard. There's the social distancing issue. That's the procurement of personal protective equipment or PPEs for learners and teachers at these schools. The sanitization issue for classrooms and for public transport that would be bringing these learners to schools. So all of that, Professor Metcalfe, needs to be taken into consideration as learners are expected to go back to school. Can it be done?
There's commitment to getting it done. I think what's uncertain is the timeframes and the readiness of the different education departments across the country. I think the most important thing that the DBE can do at the moment is to put into place effective monitoring measures. Because, Sakina, we need to know that managing schools is an important part of our overall strategy to the virus. Schools need to be part of the strategy that we're adopting as a country to limit the suppression of the academic year in schools. We need to be able to check what's happening in schools, relate it to community infection in the areas in which schools are open. So the uncertainty of timing has to do with our capability of getting all of the steps into place. To put 3,000, 3,500, 4,000 water tankers in schools and fill them up every day is a daunting challenge. But we also need to be open to new learning. Personally, in conversations that I've been privileged to have with the scientists, they are telling us that, in fact, most of the cases are asymptomatic, that as many as 50 to 80% of the infections are asymptomatic, and temperature screening won't identify people that have symptoms, teachers and learners. We need to understand how the testing is going to work and how the testing of identified learners who may be showing symptoms, how those are going to be processed and what time frame and for what purpose we're testing. We need to know that children, one of the big unknowns is even though children are low in the rate of infections, they may take infections home being asymptomatic. And our children live in multi-generational families where caregivers are often old people. So we need to be able to say, this is what we know now, this is our state of readiness, and we need to continually be responding to what we know and planning carefully on the basis of what we know. So the preconditions that the DG has stated are absolutely clear. There's got to be water, there's got to be social distancing, there's got to be the extra teachers, the PPE, the personal protective equipment has to be in place. And until that is in place, he has been clear that schools are not going to open. So the dates that are there are going to change. I have no doubt about that. And the dates that are there are going to change continually as we respond to the development of the infection and the epidemic.
Here's an interesting question from Laverne Kruger, who asks, if government can allow us to sue them if our kids contract the virus as proof they can 100% protect them, then it's okay. Otherwise, no back to school. And it speaks to the point that you just made about children maybe being asymptomatic at some point. But the question I want to ask here, in addition to what Laverne is asking, is whether parents actually have the legal right to withhold the attendance of their children to school if they fear that the conditions might not be optimal.
These are interesting legal questions, and I think we need to consider them because they're very real for education departments. I was talking to one of the provincial education departments yesterday, and they are engaging their legal component to advise them about some of these issues. In other countries that are opening, and I'll use Canada for an example, it's not from our region, and I think we've got to be careful about looking at countries that don't share our same social and economic context. But in Canada, it's optional to go back to school. And I can see from the public reaction to the announcement in Parliament or the consultation in Parliament yesterday that lots of parents are very anxious. We need, if we're going to combat this epidemic as a country, to take the public into our confidence as we consider the alternatives before us. We need to make sure that they have confidence in the decisions that government is taking, and that requires sharing information, sharing the uncertainty, being very clear about what we do know and what we don't know, and to give confidence to the public that we're going to be basing decisions about education on the best available information and with thorough consultation. You would have seen that the teacher unions came out very strongly against the proposal that we open next week. Teacher unions are partners, not only stakeholders, in combating this particular virus. And I'm sure that the Minister in her announcement today is going to be indicating that those conversations will continue until we meet the preconditions that the DG has laid out.
So, Professor, we've since learned that briefing might not happen. But you talk about the importance of teachers and through their unions, their partnership with the Department of Education here. But what about parental involvement? At which stage do you actually engage the parents? Because they are at the moment, by all indications anecdotally, pushing back against this proposal.
The pushback has been interesting. The DBE put a request on Twitter a few days ago asking parents to say, what are you most worried about? Well, asking Twitter, what are you most worried about? They had about 4,000 to 5,000 responses, and most of them were concerns about the safety of children. I think when we look at the trending yesterday on Twitter of this topic, again we see there's huge concerns about safety. Now, where the safety measures are going to be implemented is at school level. We need to make sure that our school governing bodies are as well informed as the people that are leading the decision-making, because to implement the social distancing, to implement the sanitation, to implement all of the measures that are required means that you need to have parents and teachers working at school level. So let's see that we're in this for the long haul. We're putting in place measures that are going to be with us for at least 18 months. Let's make sure that we pass on as much accurate information to all of our parents working with school governing bodies, all of our teachers working through unions and the officials of the department. But let's be certain that the DG of the Department of Basic Education has said there's preconditions that have to be met. We've got to believe in those, hold the department to it, make sure that the department is monitoring nationally as well as provincially. And if the Minister has decided to delay the announcement today, let's not be irritated with that. Let's say, good, this means that the Minister is taking into account the views that are being expressed and proceeding with her consultation with key stakeholders, proceeding with her interaction with the provincial departments. Uncertainty is the new norm. That comes with anxiety, but let's make sure that we can be making the best decisions and have confidence that those decisions are going to protect our children and our teachers.
Well, Professor Metcalfe, thank you so much for giving us so much of your time this morning. There's so much to discuss yet, but unfortunately, we are out of time on this particular discussion. Professor Mary Metcalfe is an education expert, and she, of course, is also a senior research associate at the University of Johannesburg, talking about the proposed phased reopening of schools and the preconditions that were put in place. And Professor Metcalfe saying that she doubts that we will be seeing that return as proposed of grade 7 and 12 to school next year. So we await the minister and her pronouncement on this particular matter. But it seems from all the pushback, there may be reason to go back to the drawing board. With that, let's take a quick break.